Beluga Whale Sidemen. I've got a pretty structured outline of everything that we're going to cover with 3-betting and 3-bet pots. So, without further ado, we're going to talk in detail at great length about 3-betting, 3-bet pots, and what this whole thing means. Because this is one of the spots where when I'm coaching a student, I hear one of the most common things a student will say is, I have a really hard time with 3-bet pots, and I can't seem to win money, or I'm not winning as much money as I should. So let's talk about 3-bet pots to start. The first thing that we need to do is we need to understand the context of what 3-bet pots actually mean. That's where we're going to start with that, and then we're going to move from there to understand how player types affect our situations. We're going to deal with then the responses to a 3-betting, which is going to be related to what player types we're dealing with. Then we're going to break it down step by step. We 3-bet in position. We 3-bet out of position. We get 3-bet, we're out of position. We get 3-bet, we're in position. Then we're going to talk about squeezing, how sort of a squeeze dynamic works. Then we're going to deal with deeper stack play, and then we're going to talk about a little bit with regards to heads-up play. I'm sure not all of you guys play heads-up, but it's still important to be aware of it because certainly the same themes are going to run between them both. And then after that, obviously, we'll take question and answer. But in the meantime, by the way, feel free to ask questions during it because if it's a related question during something I'm talking about, I'm happy to address it in the short term. And we'll address some of the more theoretical questions as we go a little bit farther down the line. Okay, cool. Okay, so first we're going to think about is context. To start off, it's like this. I always say this, but a 3-bet pot is a lot like a short stacked game in that the stack to pot ratio is much smaller. This has got some really, really significant effects. The first of which is that your skill and your position mean a lot less in a 3-bet pot. I.e., if we're much better than somebody, we may get some advantages out of 3-betting like we'll talk about later, but one of them is not going to be our ability to like play post-flop really well per se, because that sort of is reduced when we have less money behind. By the same token, when we're in position, it sort of helps to have more money behind as well. And we're going to talk about this stuff more in depth, but it's important to shape the dynamic of the context before we get into it. But okay, so if there's more money in the pot and less money in stacks, that means sort of intuitively that we're going to have less fold equity in general because essentially people are getting better odds. This is something that people get backwards a lot. People say, oh, well, I 3-bet pre-flop. That should mean I have more fold equity because I'm showing so much strength and showing so much aggression. Not exactly the case. People generally tend to make decisions based off of the type of cards they're getting, the board, and the type of odds they're getting. And we definitely have less fold equity for a lot of reasons in a 3-bet pot than we do otherwise. Since we have less fold equity, we're getting the showdown a whole hell of a lot more. I.e., if nobody's folding, we're going to see showdown, which is bringing us to like the sort of conclusion that you've heard me say many times before, most likely, is that equity really matters. We're going to talk about equity in something that I call the equity distribution spectrum a little bit later on in the seminar. But we're basically going to find out that our ability to win at showdown is super important and much more important when we get to showdown a lot more. And then the last sort of main thing that we're going to discuss today is the development of image and how 3-betting relates to the development of pre-flop image, which it certainly does. In fact, it's like the basis of us developing image. And then also we'll talk about some common mistakes and some things that I see rather quickly. Cool. And move on. Okay, so the first thing that we need to be able to do is to identify player types quickly, easily, without over-reliance on stats, and essentially being able to understand what our plan is against each of these types of people. There are only 3 types of players. Now, obviously, there's a spectrum within each of these. The most common type of bad player is passive. You know these players all the time. They're very easy to determine without seeing stats at all. In fact, most of these players, or pretty much all these guys, are pretty easy to determine without stats. So a passive bad player, you notice because he limps pre-flop. You notice because he limping pre-flop. They're min-raising sometimes. If they have a strong hand, they'll min-re-raise. You also see them calling a lot and folding a lot of flops to c-bets or calling and check folding. They're basically never aggressive unless they have the nuts. And we have a pretty easy plan against them, which is just to value bet them to hell and to never pay off when they raise. Very simple plan that we do with a passive bet player. And you know about how you take money from them. It's basically like pulling teeth. You wait till you have a hand, you win a big pot. When you don't have a hand, you win a lot of small pots. The only thing you can't do is lose a lot of big pots when they raise. Okay, so an aggressive bad player is the next type of player we're going to discuss. These players are actually somewhat rare because they go broke so quickly. Because if a passive bad player is sort of making you take the money away from him, an aggressive bad player is just somewhat giving it to you. They take a lot of lines that don't make sense. These people are easy to see as well because you'll see one thing at showdown that doesn't make sense. Like they 3-bet pre-flop and maybe somebody called and they ended up like checking the flop and then betting half pot in the turn and then potting the river and the person calls and they end up with like Jack 6 offsuit for Jack high. You see that once, and you probably know what I'm talking about because you see these people sort of somewhat rarely, but definitely occasionally, where you say, "Win." That doesn't make any sense at all. And all of a sudden, then our plan against them is very, very, very simple, which is that we are not going to bluff them either, like the passive bad players, but we're also going to be willing to make big calls. That's sort of the big difference. The one thing that we can't do against an aggressive bad player is we can't be inclined to bluff them because, like a passive bad player, they're going to call exorbitantly much. This is sort of the defining characteristic of badness, is the inability to, or the lack of caring to try to read a hand. They just end up making a lot of calls. It's kind of thing where you see somebody playing aggressive bad, and you decide to bluff them or rebluff them because you think they're bluffing, and they call you with pocket threes on like a King Jack 5 board, and it's like that's really dumb that I was bluffing right now. So we're going to start doing these in the 3-minute context in a second. Obviously, the last type of player is an aggressive good player. Now, good is obviously very relative because there's aggressive good players. It's going to be context. So, an aggressive good player at 1-2 might be good for 1-2. He might get absolutely destroyed at 5-10, but by the same token, he's still going to be good given the context that we're at. And basically, what good means is he's thinking about hands. He's trying to make the correct theoretical play, and these are going to be the type of players that we really need to think more critically about. Our playing gets a little bit more complicated and more difficult against them. So we're going to go into that in a little bit. But it's important that we understand these player types because we're going to deal with this a lot throughout the course of the seminar. Okay, cool. There are 3 responses to 3-betting. And we're going to sort of associate these responses with the player types. The first one that we're going to talk about is we're going to call it the passive strategy. And this is one that you see all the time. And by the way, you might see these from regulars, depending on your limit. You'll certainly see it from the bad players. Essentially what this means is the passive response is calling 3-bets and playing fit or fold. Whether or not you're playing in position, out of position, usually the most common scene is like somebody raises in mid-position. We 3-bet on the button. They call us out of position, and then they check fold. This is by far the single worst thing that you can do. Do not ever play passively to somebody who's 3-betting you aggressively because we're going to explain why right now. The most important thing is that when you are willing to call off like a lot of your stacks, say like 11 big blinds, something like that, and you then are willing to check fold a lot, you'll probably end up check folding too often, which means that you're creating a ton of dead money. An absolute ton of dead money. To the point where I talk about dead money a lot, but dead money influences our ability to do things thinly. So if we want to 3-bet somebody thinly, the fact that they're going to call and check fold a lot all of a sudden means that it's not thin anymore. The dead money that we gather is so significant that, for example, 3-betting a hand like Queen 7 suited against somebody who is going to call us and check fold out of position is definitely plus EV. Even though it's not that strong of a hand, we're going to say, I'm 3-betting this for very thin value with the intention of collecting dead money. So another reason why we really can't play this passive route is because of equity. A lot of players will take a hand like pocket 10s and they'll raise and they'll get 3-bet from someone who's got like quote unquote loose 3-betting range, and they'll say, oh well, this is too good of a hand to fold here, so I'm going to call and play out of position, not realizing that your hand's equity, even against some of the weaker hands that he might be having. Say he's 3-betting a hand like Queen Jack, or let's instead give us pocket 9s and say he's 3-betting a hand like Queen 10 or Jack 10. All of a sudden, even though we have a quote unquote great hand, we're still 50% equity. And it's really, really, really hard to play a big pot out of position when you're a flip to win against the worst of his range. Obviously, the wider that somebody's range gets, in the sense of if they're 3-betting, oh, my voice just kind of came back. if they're three betting like all kinds of studio connectors and small stuff and ace-x and everything like that, then the sort of more in theory that calling with pocket tens would be good. But the sort of downside to this is they're also creating so much dead money by three betting all these hands that we might just consider re-raising and collecting that money and getting it in if we need to. So don't overestimate. This is one of the things I see a lot. Don't overestimate your equity, which is one of the problems with the passive response, which is that people overrate nines and tens. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later in terms of the equity distribution spectrum. The last thing is the problem with set mining that we have, which is that we can't call out of position with pocket pairs with 100 big blinds attempting to flop sets because it's difficult to control pot size when we're out of position. So we basically need to stack him more often than we're going to be able to, given the fact that we don't always stack him. Sometimes we flop a set and we lose, even though that's rare. But most importantly, we're just going to end up missing the flop a lot. And we're going to basically miss the flop too often to make up for it, especially if he's distributing us with a wide range. So the moral of the passive strategy is don't do it. Don't call three bets out of position with 100 big blind stacks. Just don't. By the same reverse, as soon as you see somebody calling three bets out of position and check folding, all of a sudden then you have the license, more or less, to three bet them to death and take advantage of that dead money. That is just that's what you should be looking for, essentially. Is if you see somebody playing the passive response, all of a sudden now, man, I don't know if I should three bet this queen 9 suited. I don't know if I should three bet this queen 10. All of a sudden now you're saying, man, I'm three betting everything that looks halfway decent. Okay, cool. Okay, so we've dealt with response number one, which is the passive response, which we know we can't do, we must not do, but we definitely going to take advantage of it. We see in other people. The next response is the tight response. Now, this is actually, I used to say this sort of like disparagingly, saying that the tight response was a bad thing, but I've come to believe now that the tight response is pretty good. I want to introduce you guys at this point to a concept called game dynamics, which is essentially this. The sort of game in general, whatever site you're playing at, over the course of maybe a few months will have a dynamic that's going to sort of change in these broad strokes, i.e. it won't be very 3-bet happy, and then all of a sudden it'll get really 3-bet happy, and then after a while it won't get as 3-bet happy. Currently, I've generally found the games, especially in mid-stakes games, but even like at 50 Cent 1 and 1-2, I've started getting a lot more 3-bet happy. The way we understand this and deal with this is basically the tight strategy starts to look pretty good, because when everyone else is getting really, really splashy, the way we can take advantage of that is to just not be splashy. We can let other people pay off badly against us. We don't mind folding for 3 big blinds 5 times. We lose 15 big blinds if he's going to stack off, with ace-jack when we should get it in with pocket kings or pocket aces. That's fine. So let's discuss what the tight strategy is really fast, quickly. The tight strategy essentially means that you're going to assign your opponent like a reasonably strong range, and that instead of making loose call downs and stuff like this, that in general what you're going to do is you're going to make some small mistakes here or there, and you're going to count on your opponents to make really big mistakes down the line. Like, let's say you fold to 3-bets. This is one of my favorite things. Let's say you folded to a 3-bet 10 times in a row, and then the 11th time you get aces and you re-raise, and the guy goes, oh, well, I've 3-bet him so many times, he must be playing back light now. It's like, are you crazy? You've been folding for the last times. You're obviously waiting for a hand. Most players, for whatever reason, don't pick up on this, and so thus playing tight works pretty well. The sort of other thing that I want you to think about in terms of playing tight is this. It's virtually impossible to lose money playing tight. If you see like the super nits at your table, the guys who play like 12, 10, 7, 6, stuff like that, these guys are not making much money. They're missing out on a ton of plus EV opportunities, for sure. That said, they're basically losing almost nothing. They're sort of breaking even. So breaking even is much better than losing. So if we're going to say the passive response is losing, and the 3-betting, and the tight response, is at worst break even, the tight response is at least a improvement. Oftentimes the tight response is correct if, number one, your opponent is going to be basically only 3-betting a super tight range. Let's say that Mr. Ultimate Passive you raise in a 1-2 game, you raise to 7, and he 3-bets you to 30, and he's never 3-bet you in 10 hours of playing with him. Tight response is obviously fitting. But by the same token, if you think that somebody's like playing really back really loosely, but they're also going to pay off super light, the tight response is fine also. If a guy who 3-bets me 20% of the time, 3-bets me, but I know he's going to stack off with ace 10 plus, I don't need to make a 4-bet bluff with my jack 8 suited. I can just fold and just wait till I get something that beats ace 10 plus and then stack off with it, obviously. That's one that the less response that's possible to 3-betting. I call the aggressive response. Now, the problem with it's sort of a misnomer is that the tight response is definitely also aggressive. It's not like if we're waiting for a big hand that we're going to play it passively or something like that in the previous response. So it's not as though that they're both aggressive responses. But the reason why I call this the aggressive response is this: instead of just waiting for your opportunity to get a strong hand and play back, the aggressive response basically goes ahead and seizes this opportunity, retakes the aggression, and deals with it. Now, it's important for a few things. Number one, we do not need to get super aggressive lightly if people are stacking off light. This is what I'm talking about. Why I said the tight response is pretty good. Is that if you think if we're gonna if somebody's going to be 5-bet shoving over our 4-bets with a wide range, 4-bet bluffing is obviously bad. But so we're going to sort of talk about this in more context later. But the aggressive response essentially means not folding to the aggression. It could mean 4-betting light. It could mean calling in position and playing back like that. We're still going to keep calling out of position, given the 100 big blind stacks, out of the picture. And we'll probably go into that more in terms of when we talk about deep stack play. But the aggressive response is what you want to take when somebody is playing back aggressively against you, or light 3-betting you lightly and stuff like that. But by the same token, they're playing pretty well. I.e., they're 3-betting you a lot, but they're not going to stack off with King Jack. And so it's we have to basically take a more appropriate response against them. And the way we do this to start off with is basically understanding frequency. What frequency means is how often somebody's 3-betting you. It needs to be actually somewhat high, like you'll know. People always ask me, how do I know if someone's 3-betting me enough? And my answer is always like, you'll know. Someone has to be 3-betting you a lot for us to get really, really amped up into the aggressive mode. If somebody, you look at their stats and you say, oh, this guy 3-bets 12%, and he just 3-bet me for the first time this session, he's probably got a really light range. That's not reliable enough. What's reliable is I've been playing for 10 minutes and he's 3-bet me 5 times. Like I said, you'll know. We're going to talk about why we don't need to use stats as much in a second. But usually they'll be sort of like, we talked about these player types. We're going to get back to this in a second. But the aggressive good players, you'll usually be able to pick out, okay, this guy's got a 2+2 looking name. He's sitting at 6 tables, and he's got a full stack on all of them, and he's 3-bet me a bunch of times. This is the type of player, an aggressive good player, that we're going to be really interested in maybe taking an aggressive response against. And obviously these are the types of players that will probably be taking aggressive responses against us. Okay, so we have the 3 responses. They are aggressive, tight, and passive. And we have the 3 player types: passive bad, aggressive bad, and aggressive good. And by the way, if you guys ever find an aggressive or a passive good player, please let me know. Never seen it happen before, but I'd love to meet one. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, we're going to break these down into these 4 segments, is this idea of 3-betting in position. So we talked about an aggressive bad or a passive bad player is the type of person who's really likely to call us out of position with a wide range of hands and check fold a lot of flops. Maybe check call one street and then fold another street. Maybe check call down. I don't know. But in general, we're going to assume they're going to check fold a lot. And we'll sort of like adjust that read as necessary as we go. So how do we deal with this? Well, the first thing we can't do is 3-bet hands that don't play well in 3-bet pots. I.e., it's not good for us to 3-bet 7-5 offsuit against him if he's going to call us with Jack 5 offsuit. essentially our equity is too bad that even though he's going to create a ton of dead money, we can't very well call it a thin value bet pre-flop. We'd have to call it a thin bluff, and as we said a little bit ago, thinly bluffing is not going to be good against bad players. So every time you're thinking about whether or not you're going to 3-bet, ask yourself, well, I'm doing this for value. The goal is to get called by some worse hands. Are there worse hands? Okay, yeah, let's say I'm 3-betting queen 7 suited. Well, he could certainly call me with 7-6, 8-7, 9-7, 9-8, stuff like that. Jack 10, all these kinds of things that he could call me with, sure. So you can call me with worse hands. Then you say, okay, well, he's going to call and check fold a lot. Well, if the answer is yes, then we're going to say, okay, I'm 3-betting for thin value, and then I'm going to c-bet to collect a lot of dead money. So what we start to find is we're going to expand our value range to make it very wide against both these types of players. So all of a sudden, we're going to say ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, king 10, king queen, king jack, queen 10, queen jack, queen 9, jack 10, jack 9, 10 9, and then we start getting into, now it's starting to get a little bit too thin. But you can see what I'm saying, which is that the worse the person is, the more they're calling and check folding, the more we're able to widen our value range and take advantage of the dead money. So you say you start 3-betting, so you don't really know how they're going to respond. So you start 3-betting, let's say you 3-bet them with ace queen, and they call out a position and check fold. Well, the next time around, you 3-bet them with king 8 suited, and they call out a position, and then they check fold. Well, then the next time, I'm going to 3-bet them with queen 5 suited, and then they call and they check fold out position. Well, now I can basically keep on moving down the range. Now, eventually, and we're going to talk about this equity distribution later, as I said, eventually we get to a point where we say, well, I really can't 3-bet 8-4 suited for value here, so I'm not going to. So as a result, we're not going to play polarized. We're going to fold the junk. We're going to play all the good stuff. We're going to expand what the good stuff actually means to capitalize on dead money. Okay, now a caveat on image. We do not need to create image against bad players. Image is created for the purpose of creating mistakes in our opponents. When our opponents are making a ton of mistakes already, we don't need to do things like 3-bet, say, 7-4 offsuit to make him screw up. He's going to do that quite naturally. So don't. It's like a bad play in general, especially given that we don't get any real benefits from the image element of it. What about an aggressive good player? Well, let's think about our assumptions with an aggressive good player. An aggressive good player is extremely unlikely to call our 3-bets out of position. Now, I'm not going to say never, because some players will, but they're extremely unlikely, and we'll be very surprised if that's the case. And I'll explain why I'm using this terminology in a moment. So against an aggressive good player, we can assume that if we 3-bet them with a hand like ace queen, his response is usually going to be to 4-bet or to fold. Well, if he's going to 4-bet, and let's say we think he's 4-betting with a relatively appropriate range against which ace queen isn't super profitable. Obviously aces, kings, queens, ace king, maybe jacks, and then a few bluffs. It's not going to be great for us per se to 3-bet ace queen and then either fold to a 4-bet or get it in. So basically what happens when we 3-bet ace queen, assuming that we're going to fold, or that if we get it all in, it's basically a break-even play, is that ace queen is basically the same as any 2 cards. So you guys were never taking a flop with it. We're just basically 3-betting it and more or less wasting the value of our hand. So we start to find that, well, hey, if I want to keep 3-betting him, but it doesn't matter what I have, couldn't I just 3-bet him with any 2 cards if ace queen is the same as 7 deuce off in this scenario? And the answer is yes. You guys have license to 3-bet with any 2 cards. But there's an important caveat. A moment ago I said we'll be very surprised if we find that he calls us out of position. We'd also be very surprised if somebody called us in the blinds, cold called us in the blinds. So if there's a possibility that we could get stuck, we usually don't want to 3-bet hands that are totally screwed in 3-bet pots. Stuff like 7-4 offsuit, 8 deuce offsuit, stuff like that. Even though it would be kind of fun to do it with, the danger of us getting called and being stuck is much worse. So what types of hands do we do it with? Well, one of the things that I usually go with is if I was going to raise a hand already, but I can't call with it. For example, let's say I had ace-6 off on the button. Well, I was planning on raising ace-6 off. It was folded to me. But since the mid-position aggressive good player raised, I can't call with ace-6 off. But this is the type of hand where if I 3-bet it and let's say the big blind wakes up with pocket jacks or the pre-flop raiser has pocket 10s and he calls you out of position, I'm not totally screwed. I've got 33% equity or so, and I should be able to to play a fair amount of flops in position profitably if that were to happen. So what I'm saying is this. You can 3-bet any 2 cards. The slight caveat of that is that you should be prepared in the event that something bad happens. So you will generally prefer to 3-bet hands that will, at least bail you out if you get screwed. You don't have to, but you should at least sort of emphasize that. So what we see now is we see this development that's starting to happen where we have a polarized situation where we're 3-betting the really strong stuff that we're sure we can 3-bet for value. Aces, kings. That's usually against an aggressive good player where like my value range stops to start off with. Because even queens, I feel like I can usually play more profitably, calling and playing in position post-flop. But so what you're going to see is that I'm not going to start off balanced. I'm starting off with aces and kings and then a ton of junk. The reason for this is that I don't think that he's going to play back often enough at me because usually people don't pull the trigger often enough. So let's say I've started 3-betting a bunch of junk and then eventually he starts playing back more with light hands. Now we've developed image. Now this has been created. Now I can easily 3-bet queens and ace-king for value because he's definitely going to stack off with ace-queen and pocket jacks. Well, if I keep going, he's going to even 4-bet bluff with a lot more hands, which means I probably can collect enough dead money to profitably 3-bet jacks, 10s, and shove over the top of his 4-bet. We start to see how this stuff sort of snowballs into the widening of our value range because we start off with this polarized, unbalanced 3-betting strategy. Cool. I feel like that was interesting. Okay. Next thing. So we are out of position now, and let's say the button raises to steal, and we're trying to decide what it is that we should do with regards to 3-betting. So we decide we're going to 3-bet out of position against a passive bad or an aggressive bad player. Our strategy is more or less the same, which is essentially that we're going to have a wide value range. We're going to capitalize on their dead money when they play fit or fold post-flop. When people are playing the passive strategy against us post, we feel really, really confident that we can just collect so much dead money that it's not even going to matter. Not a whole lot to be said extra there because it's just the same thing that we talked about a second ago. However, against an aggressive good player, things start to change. This is where one of the places where we can get a lot of money from regulars, which is this. Aggressive good players often make the mistake of defending against 3-bets too lightly. They start calling almost like bad players with hands that are not great in 3-bet pots. Low stuff, 7-8 suited, Jack 10 off, stuff like that. So what we want to do again, that if they're calling with bad hands, we then suddenly want to expand our value range. So when we were in position, we couldn't 3-bet, let's say, ace-jack for value because the guy's just going to 4-bet us and we'd have to fold. But when we're out of position, if he's going to call us with 8-7 suited, why the hell wouldn't we want to get more money in as a huge favorite preflop? So we depolarize, we drop all the junk, and we start adding more of the big cards that we can get for value. We maybe add some extra pairs that we wouldn't have 3-bet before, jacks, 10s, 9s, stuff like that we know has good equity, and we're basically doing this pretty clearly for value. So essentially, we're starting to address the same strategy that we had a second ago, which is the widening of our value range and decreasing our quote-unquote bluffing range, because it's not good to bluff somebody who's likely to call you with a lot of stuff. So then this is the next sort of obvious question. Well, people say, well, what in the hell are you balancing your 3-betting range with against good players? Is it all for value? Well, so long as my opponents are playing too loosely, then the answer is generally yes. I don't need to be very balanced. But what happens if my opponents start playing a little tighter? Well, obviously I need to 3-bet more to compensate for them playing tighter. So what am I going to add? And the answer is we want to add hands that play well in 3-bet pots. So the first thing that plays pretty well in 3-bet pots are high cards. So we're not really going to count. If we're 3-betting Ace Jack and King Queen for value, that's not really balancing. What about a hand like Ace 8 suited, Ace 7 suited, King 9 suited? All of a sudden now we've got a big card, which means that we're going to be okay in a 3-bet pot. We have suitedness, which means that we can win some pots unexpectedly and make some bluffs unexpectedly. Essentially, we have more equity. We can stay more aggressive. And so we have big cards. We have like one big card, one low card suited. And then we also start to have small pairs. Fanshaw, who's a Beluga Poker member, asked the question, well, what should we be doing? Should I be calling with my small pairs out of position, pre-flop? It's going to be hard to set mine. The guy's got a wide range. He's unlikely to pay off. Should I 3-bet them? Should I fold them? What should I do? One of the things that I say is if we don't have any post-flop image, if we can't expect to get a check raise paid off when we flop a set, it's not bad to 3-bet small pairs that like sort of without any history, because they play well in post-flop spots. They when they hit, they win for sure, and it's one of those things where it's like we're counting on our tight image for sure to be able to 3-bet this and get a lot of folds with the C-bets and whatnot to capitalize on dead money, but if we're going to widen our 3-betting range, we want to choose hands that play well when there's more money in the pot, less money behind, and that's sort of the definition of pairs. There's a reason why in tournament poker, pairs are the nuts. You shove them in pre all the time. You get money with them pre all the time because they play really well and there's not a lot of money behind. It's the same general principle when we're dealing with 3-bet pots out of position. So now the next issue that we start to deal with is so now we've talked about us 3-betting. Now, what about when we get 3-bet? This is where a lot of people get a little bit fuzzy. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is we want to choose which of the two workable responses, whether or not we want to choose the tight response or the aggressive response, depending on the game dynamic situation. I.e., if everyone's super splashy and payoff happy, we should play tightly. If everyone's playing super nitty, we should play tightly. If people are playing pretty well, or this guy's playing pretty well, then we want to probably play aggressively. So the first thing, again, is we need to say, okay, frequency. How often is this person 3-betting me? And this is why I put this note in here that says, be careful with stats. Be careful with stats. Because if somebody's 3-bet percentage is 12, that is not describing their 3-bet percentage against you raising out of the gun. That's describing their 3-bet percentage in all cases. Then you might say, oh, what's their button 3-bet percentage? That is not descriptive enough either. That describes him 3-betting on the button against anyone raising from any position. If you had a stat that said him 3-betting you when you raise under the gun, when he's on the button, this session, that would be useful. So rely more on what you've seen than the stats that you've gathered. Essentially, if someone's never 3-bet me before, I don't care if their 3-bet percentage says 80. If they've never 3-bet me before, we've been playing for a while, then that's not important to me. Okay, so we have the frequency. Now we decide that we are going to we decide to play back because this person is 3-betting us a lot, and we think there's enough dead money to collect that we can do this profitably. So the first thing we want to do is, so we know we can't call out of position, so we decide that we're going to 4-bet or fold. So the first thing we have to decide is what types of cards do we want to 4-bet with? Well, if we're bluffing, if we're not bluffing, it's pretty easy. Big, premiums and stuff. Really down to queens, jacks. We'll talk about queens and jacks. That's sort of at the bottom of this PowerPoint. But let's talk about the bluffing element first. If we're going to 4-bet bluff, obviously it's nice to have kind of blockers, things that prevent combinations of him having big pairs. Ace X, King X are both good things for us to be able to 4-bet as a bluff because it reduces the possibility of him having aces, kings, ace, king, etc. The other thing that works really well are pairs. I'm going to talk about pairs in a second. But so the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what size are we going to 4-bet? I'm going to give you guys a blanket. Rarely will I give you guys like an actual concrete number that'll help you, or like, this is what you should do. But given 100 big blind stacks, and given a competent opponent who's will never call your 4-bet, you usually want to make your 4-bet about 25 big blinds total, about a quarter of your stack, given 100 big blinds. This is pretty much close to the accurate leverage point. It essentially accomplishes, it gives you the ability to bluff without losing too much. It also gives him the when you're 4-betting with a really strong hand for value, like say aces or kings. We like to do this too because it gives them the chance to come over the top. It's just basically better to balance this raise size than to raise more, because if we make it say 33 big blinds, all of a sudden we're accomplishing the same thing, but we're essentially spending more money to do it, so we can't bluff as often, so the whole thing becomes less profitable. Okay. But if we're going to 4-bet with a hand that we have to stack off with, let's say pocket jacks. A lot of players, because they 4-bet small everything, get in the habit of 4-betting pocket jacks small. Why? It's a question I ask my students often. Why would you 4-bet jacks small? Well, when we 4-bet aces small, it's with the hope that we're inducing him to shove in, with ace queen, something like that, pocket queen, something like that. When we 4-bet jack small, we actually would prefer he folded ace queen. Even though we're a favorite, there's so much money in the pot that he's playing correctly by shoving. Whereas if he folds, he's playing incorrectly, and that's better for us. So what I've gotten a habit of, if someone's 3-betting me a lot, I'll just start shoving pairs. I'll just, go ahead and stick it in. And people say, oh, this looks really spewy when you shove pocket sixes in, and he calls you with pocket kings. But the simple truth is that in most cases, sixes are going to be the same as jacks, because the guy's probably not 3-betting you with pocket sevens. And if he is, he's not stacking off when you shove, most likely. So in general, we want to 4-bet small. With certain hands, we want to 4-bet as a shove. And then people say, well, isn't that so obvious to say that, if you're 4-betting shoving pairs, couldn't he just 3-bet and stack off with, like ace-jack? Well, if he's gonna 3-bet stack off ace jack, we're gonna have a beautiful time shoving ace king, ace queen, pocket queens, everything. It's easy for us to readjust quite quickly. Okay, so Finzi, another Beluga Poker member, had a question, basically saying, when I raise ace king or pocket or queens or a hand like that, and he 3-bets me a lot, if I get it in, I'm usually getting it in against a flip or worse. And, so that inclines me to want to call. He had queens in the situation. He calls with queens out of position. And he decides to, wait and see if there's an ace or a king flop, and then, act accordingly. It goes like this. If somebody has enough air that we can call and play out of position profitably, they have enough air that we can 4-bet profitably and just, settle for a flip or worse if we get called. On the flip side, if someone doesn't have enough air that we can call and play out of position, then they don't have enough air for us to do anything. We should fold. It's not the end of the world to raise ace king, have a guy who plays 5-0 3-bet you and fold. That's okay. When there's a lot of dead money involved, we're usually best off just 4-betting these hands and getting them in. Especially since you could maybe just make a justification and say, well, maybe I could get thin value from jacks or ace queen or something. But usually the moral of the story is, like, we're accepting that when we get in, we're flipping or worse, but the guy's got a wide enough range that we're just going to collect dead money. Okay. We get 3-bet in position. That's the last of our 4 quadrants, if you will, of dealing with 3-betting. So the first thing to think about is this. When you raise on the button, you should be aware of who's in the blinds. This is a discussion of isolation, which is going to be for another day. But if somebody is 3-betting you a lot, a good way to respond to start off with is to lower your pre-flop raise size. That gives you more freedom to play post-flop. It gives him less incentive to collect dead money from your raise because there's less money to win. It just is better for you in a lot of ways. Now, if you've got bad players in the blinds, you should still raise big. But if you've got a good aggressive player who's 3-betting you a lot, then you should raise smaller. Okay, so then you say, well, I'm going to choose my response. Is this guy 3-betting me a ton? Is he going to pay off light or no? If he's going to pay off light, then we'll play the tight strategy. If he's not going to pay off light, then we're going to think about the aggressive strategy. The number one mistake that people make when they get 3-bet in position, or I guess there's two. The number one mistake, we'll start with the number one. The number one mistake people make when they get 3-bet in position is they call with bad hands, call with hands that do not have good equity. They overvalue the use of position and skill in a 3-bet pot because they say, oh, I'm in position and I'm good, so I should be able to screw this up post. But the problem is there's so much money in the pot already that those factors are mitigated enough that calling with low cards, 8-7 suited, even like Queen Jack. Queen Jack is sort of right on the borderline. The calling with low cards is, it's not, you can't overcome it given position and skill. We talk about card advantage, skill advantage, and positional advantage. Your card advantage is affected by the stack to pot ratio, i.e., the more money in the pot, the more you having bad cards is bad. You can get away with having bad cards if there's a million big blinds behind because you can play. Okay, cool. The other mistake that I've written down here as the 4-betting mistake is for people to snap 4-bet and get it in with a lot of hands just because they feel like they should because it's the standard. Most especially, I'm talking about pocket queens and ace-king again. When somebody 4-bets ace-queen on the button, or let's say ace-king. When someone 4-bets ace-king on the button, and I ask why, there's usually not a good answer. Because the other guy is going to more or less play perfectly. If he has ace-queen or ace-jack 3-betting, he's just going to fold those. And that's obviously bad for us. If he's got aces, kings, queens, he's going to shove those, and that's obviously bad for us. The only reason why we'd be able to 3-bet ace-king profitably on the button, or not profitably, but have that be the best play, would be if he was going to shove ace-queen, if we're confident that he would get it in with ace-queen pre. We usually can't be that confident. So, what we do instead is we get prepared to call with ace-king. Let him keep the worst hands in his range in the pot, and let him try to play perfectly post-flop with a bad hand against the top of our range when he's out of position. Hint, he won't. He can't. So, this is a really, really common thing to do for me. So I raise ace-king on the button. The big blind 3-bets me. I call. The flop comes down 10-5-4. He c-bets. This is a spot where a lot of people would say, oh man, I'm going to give up here. We are not going to give up with ace-king here for a few reasons. Number one, when we called pre-flop, we thought he had a relatively wide range for 3-betting us, wider than just jacks are better and ace-king. So, if more than half of his range doesn't have a pair, which it won't, we're winning, and that's good. So we're basically correctly calling for value. If he has a hand like jacks or queens, we've got 6 good outs, and we're in position. But the coolest thing about calling in position here is if an ace or a king peels off, he's going to try to represent ace-king with his entire range. You call, he's got, say, king-queen. You call the flop, the turn card's an ace. He picks up a gut shot on a 10-5-4 ace board, and he shoves. Because he says, oh, I can rep ace-king. Well, unfortunately for him, we have ace-king. And so this is how this works. So then you say, well, what happens if I call on a 10-5-4 board, and he checks the turn. Let's say a 4 peels off on the turn, so it's 10-5-4-4. He checks the turn. Do we check or bet? Well, this depends on a lot of things. If he's got a ton of air in his range, then we should bet and make him fold out his equity share. If he doesn't have that much air in his range, we should check it back because we're a little afraid of getting check raised. And we can sort of see what happens on the river. And once again, it's good if an ace or a king peels off because it gives him a chance to bluff at it. And usually with ace-king, we're going to check the river. But what about if on the same board we had pocket eights? We call the flop. The flop is, or we call pre on the 3-bet. The flop is 10-5-4. We call a c-bet. The turn card is a 4. He checks. Same reasons as before, we check. The river card comes 5. So it's 10-5-4-4-5. And he checks. I see people here check all the time with their pocket eights. Is there any doubt in your mind that you have the best hand? Is there any doubt whatsoever? You know you're winning. So make a value bet. People say, well, I can't expect him to call me with ace-king there. Well, probably not if you pot it. But what if you bet 1/5 pot? I'm thinking in terms of high stakes right now, but if the pot is 800 on the river, instead of betting 500, bet 150. What you'll find is that he may call, but he may fold. But the nice thing about this is we're going to make this play with both eights and ace-queen. So essentially, it's going to be impossible for him to guess with the right frequency what we have. And sometimes it's basically effectively bluff him off ace-king with ace-queen. And other times we'll effectively get value with eights against ace-king. But it's going to be very hard for him to play. The moral of the story is do not check back there with pocket eights. Okay. We're talking about raising the flop in a second. When we talk about squeezes. But for now, we're going to talk about the value of pairs and equity distribution. This is something that I was talking about before. The equity distribution spectrum. Okay. So there's this sort of tendency to believe that pocket eights are as far in value from pocket deuces as they are from pocket aces. That seeing as eights or nines are sort of smack in the middle of the spectrum, that they should have the sort of equities equally distributed. This would be true if everyone was playing every card, any two cards. However, since people play high cards, coordinated cards, much more often than low cards, we start to find that the equity of our hands is not a straight line, but rather a curve. And that pocket eights or pocket nines play a whole hell of a lot closer to pocket sixes than they do to pocket queens. If you've ever seen a graph of someone's profits by hand, you'll see that aces are way at the top, followed by kings a fair amount below, followed by queens way below that. But once you get down to eights and nines, they're roughly as profitable as Jack 10 suited, which makes sense because they're 50% equity against each other. So don't get super inclined to say, oh, he 3-bets me, and so I'm going to call with my pocket fives and defend. Because pocket fives are not going to be beating anything. If he's 3-betting you light with 6-7 suited, we are not getting value per se by calling with fives. Even though 6-7 suited is some of the lowest cards you could possibly be playing. Okay. Hope everyone got that. It's important. Okay. So one of the most common places that people have big problems with is squeezing. People are not sure how often they should be squeezing. People get uncomfortable when they get squeezed. So we're going to talk about this a little bit right now, and we're sort of relate some other things back to it as well. So squeezing is a change of context. The perceived range of the squeezer is wider. What this means when we're squeezing is that we need to anticipate less fold equity post-flop, which means that we can have wider value. A hand like King 10 offsuit might be too thin to 3-bet in a normal situation, but on the other hand, it might be legitimate to squeeze with because we think someone's really likely to call us with Jack 10 and try to play back because our range appears so much wider. So we're going for thin value with a wider range, and it's compensated, like we said before, dead money compensates for thin value. It's compensated by the fact that there's extra people calling pre-flop. There's a lot more dead money in the pot, so that's pretty good. So then we start to find out that squeezing or that light squeezing affects a lot of different things. So, for example, if we have pocket queens on the button and we're trying to decide if we should 3-bet it for value, and we know there's a light squeezer in the blinds, that adds more value to us cold calling or just flatting pre-flop and back raising. Squeezing is at its heart a table dynamic situation. The one thing I would say for us is to not overestimate the width of somebody's squeezing range. Most players don't squeeze often enough. One of the more common mistakes that I see is a half-stacked fish raises and we call with whatever, and the blind squeezes, quote unquote, he's not squeezing a half-stacked fish light. He's three-betting for value. This is why three-betting and whatnot, or squeezing a lot is good in a sense of that it looks the same as raising for value. Very hard for people to differentiate per se what your range actually looks like. So in general, we're just going to widen our value range for squeezing. King X, Queen X suited, big cards, one high, one low suited. Usually with a small pair, we're not going to 3-bet because we'd rather see a multi-way flop, and that's fine. Okay. What happens if we get squeezed? Well, if we get squeezed, we have a few options. We can 4-bet, which will follow the same rules as 4-betting before. If we're in position, we can call light and make big call downs, perhaps, post-flop. Or what we can do is we can raise the flop as a bluff. When we raise the flop, I want to get us back to this hand we called pre-flop with ace-king. The flop is 10-5-4. What if instead we called pre-flop with king-queen instead of ace-king, and the flop was 10-5-4? Well, all of a sudden we got some big issues. An ace is no longer good for us. We can't be confident about getting the showdown and having our king be good. Our outs are not as clean. If we hit a queen or a king, it's somewhat likely that we're going to lose our stack. So floating doesn't seem very good to us. But if someone has enough air in their range for c-betting that flop that we could raise profitably, and all it takes is a min raise, then raising the flop becomes a good idea. Now, the sort of reason why I put this in with squeezing is because squeezing times, people oftentimes have a lot more air on the flop. So if we're going to call and play back, calling and then min-raising against a squeeze is a pretty good way to defeat a light squeezer, because they're going to c-bet a lot of air, and instead of floating, we just take a hand that has no value, that we're going to fold to a c-bet anyway, and we just put in like a min-raise. And you'll be amazed at how effective that actually works. The last thing I wanted to talk about quickly was if we're on the button, and this is from the last, if we're on the button from the previous slide, and we raise and we get 3-bet, our value range should be tremendously narrow, and our bluff range usually should be close to non-existent, because we're giving him a tight range for 3-betting us usually from the blinds, and he's going to shove pretty much all of it over a 4-bet. Right? He's going to fold maybe like ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10. But the problem is if we start 4-betting really light there, he's just too likely to shove in jacks, queens, ace-queen, stuff like that, for us to be really happy 4-betting light. Now, it's obviously a spectrum. So the wider he's shoving in pre, the wider our value range is pre. The tighter he is, the wider our bluff range should be. But I would say usually, instead of 4-betting for value with pretty much anything but aces and kings, it's almost always more profitable to call pre and play post-flop. Let him make mistakes there. Okay. Oh, we have a question over here. Edward, we're going to have our first audience participation. I'm going to unmute Edward now. Edward, you're on. What's your question?
I wanted to ask right what you were talking about right now. So we're in the button, and I've been thinking about, you said that 5s and 8s are essentially the same hand in this sort of situation. We raise 5s to 8s or something, and so are you saying that essentially I should just be pitching my 8s, even if I think this guy is 3-betting like maybe 9, 10 suited, Jack 10 suited, as well as his value range?
Okay, yeah, sure. No, this is a totally good question. Okay, well, so we probably, okay, 4-betting here and getting it in, or just 4-bet shoving would not be awful. As I basically said, it's kind of the funniest cop out of all time, that you can kind of just shove pairs when people are 3-betting lightly. I'm going to put you on mute for a second. If you have another question, follow-up, just type it in, okay? The sort of response is this. As we said before, pairs play well in 3-bet pots, even low ones, right, which I said don't have a lot of advantages. If somebody's 3-betting you a lot, you can get away with basically playing a 50-50 pot in position. Okay? Your hand is usually good enough. That said, if somebody's 3-betting you not that much, then all of a sudden those 50-50s start to be not as good because you're not going to be 50-50 as often as you were before. So what I would say is this. It's okay to call with 8s, to call with 5s, and to, like we talked about before on the 10-5-4 board, to call, play, check back the turn, and then make a really small value bet on the river. That's fine. We basically need to be aware that we're going to not win the pot as often. Well, this is one of the things that's sort of really understated in three-bet pots, which is that like a lot of money goes in pre, and just winning that is good. Everyone's always worried about, if I 3-bet ace-4 offsuit or ace-4 suited pre-flop, and I get called, I won't be able to get any value if I flop an ace. That's fine. You got a lot of value already. You 3-bet. Now just try to win. Get yourself the pot. So the answer is that not that you can't defend with a hand like 8s or 5s, something like that. Is just to be aware of your equity and know that the tighter the guy's range is, the less that's going to be good. And sort of the other thing to keep in mind is that against somebody who's 3-betting a hand like 9-10 suited, if they're good, they're obviously not that good because that's not a great hand to 3-bet, but most likely they'll be trying to continue with aggression on a lot of boards. This is the type of spot against that type of player you may be inclined to have to make big call downs to the type of hand against this type of player. Which is sort of like if we have, let's say, 10s instead of 5s, the call down is not nearly as big. Good. I'm going to move on to the next part, which I think deep stack. There was a quick hand here that Beluga Poker member EdgeSick posted that I wanted to talk about briefly, which is that pre-flop here, we squeeze with ace-7 suited. Perfect. The under-the-gun raiser calls. Okay. We flop an ace. We bet. This is what we're talking about just a second ago. We most likely have the best hand. We've sort of won the pot. Now we're going to bet for a few reasons. We're going to bet for thin value. We're going to bet to try to get him to fold his equity share because we think he's never going to bluff us if we check. I.e., who the hell checks an ace-deuce-8 board with air? If he has a hand like pocket 10s, it's not good for us to let him try to get the showdown, but more importantly, to let him try to spike a 10. So we bet the flop for thin value and to collect dead money, and we get a call. So now we think he either has an ace, a mid-pair like 10s, jacks that they want to make a call with, or a flush draw. The turn card's a king. We decide it's too thin to bet for value. That's probably fine. We check, and he bets really small. At this point, we either need to fold or shove because there's a lot of hands that have equity against us, and I think that we should shove here because basically a lot of the hands that have equity against us, we want them to either fold now or make a bad call, so like any flush draw. And a lot of the hands that have us beat, for example, a hand like ace-10, we underestimate how many outs we have against ace-10 right now, i.e. any 7, any 8, any deuce, all live outs against ace-10. Then we also consider that this player wasn't very good. It's quite possible he's taking this line with ace-4, ace-5, ace-6, which we can certainly get value from. I think we should shove this turn. Sort of a little unrelated, but I promised I would answer people's questions. So, as we talked about before, when we're in a 3-bet pot situation, it effectively reduces the stack sizes, which creates less fold equity, and we get the showdown more often. This is significant. On the flip side, when we have deeper stacks, we can create more fold equity and see fewer showdowns, and we start to see some significant changes in value, and all of a sudden we can start 3-betting some stuff that we wouldn't maybe normally 3-bet. So what is the deeper stacks effect on card value in a 3-bet pot? Well, when we play really deep stacked, really 200 big blinds to 300 plus, we want to be the one with the nuts, not the one with the second nuts or fifth nuts. And so hands that make nut hands often, it's like ace-x suited, or basically stuff like the stuff that makes top set, we'll talk about this in a second, have more value for us in bigger pots. So, whereas we might have called with, say, ace-5 suited pre-flop, 100 big blinds, we should probably 3-bet that 200 or 300 big blinds deep, because it's going to basically play really well when we both flop flushes or flush draws. By the same token, the stuff that makes the smaller flushes is maybe not as good. So this is just sort of a general comment in about deep stack play, which is that medium to high pairs play much better because they make top set, not because they're necessarily going to be great as a one pair hand, but oversetting somebody while sort of random at 100 big blinds is significant at 300 big blinds. Then you say, by the same token, sort of flushing over flushing. By the same token, you say, well then, getting overflushed or getting oversetted is a lot worse. So low pairs and suited connectors go down in value. But this is the beauty of deep stack. When you're deep stacked, you have enough money behind to maintain fold equity. So we can 3-bet suited connectors and play them in a deep stack spot, relying on the fact that we still have fold. I mean, we raise suited connectors in the 100 big blind spot when it comes to us because we're counting our ability to use fold equity later. It's the same situation in a deep stack spot. We can 3-bet these hands and count on being able to make him fold later. I.e., we don't have to give up after a c-bet per se. So what we'll start to find then is that as we get deep, we should 3-bet a lot more. Ace-X suited, King-X suited, suited connectors, medium to high pairs, so all of a sudden 8s, 9s, these are 3-bets all the time. By the same token, low pairs and big offsuit cards go way down in value, so we usually want to keep those pots smaller and just call with them. For example, 3-betting Ace-Jack from the blinds when you're 300 big blinds deep with your Ace-Jack offsuit, for example, is not good. That's a walk towards disaster. By the same token, trying to get 300 big blinds in with bottom set on a dry board is usually going to be bad for us as well, although it's not as bad as the other one. Okay, last thing, talking about heads up quickly. J-Man, Phil Galfond, had a really good piece of advice that I liked a lot. That was, you have to be careful with your 3-betting. To not over 3-bet because it feels good. Somebody playing the quote-unquote tight response, or even like a moderated aggressive response, is going to fold a lot to our 3-bets. That makes us think that we're winning because we're winning a lot of small pots. Now, this is certainly good to be doing this stuff, but don't then play badly in other spots because of this sort of idea of we call it unreasonable mental reinforcement, which is like, oh, I'm winning because I'm winning a lot of pots. Money is what matters, not pots. So when you're playing, this is especially related to heads up, but it's also related to other stuff as well. Don't just 3-bet everything all the time if your opponent's playing back relatively well against you. You can 3-bet a lot, but then you get Queen 9 suited. Okay, well, I'm going to call out a position instead of 3-betting it, or maybe you mix it up with a big pair sometime. Just see what happens. Beware of this idea of like, oh, I'm 3-betting, I'm winning a lot of small pots. That means I'm winning the most money. That's not always the case. In a heads-up pot, we 3-bet pairs all the time, or in a heads-up pot, in a heads-up game, we 3-bet pairs pretty much every time we get them, for a few reasons. Number one, as we said, they play well in a shallow spot, so that we want to decrease the stacks to a certain degree, as in terms of their pair value. They are very easy to play post-flop, but even more than that, people 4-bet very lightly in heads-up spots. It's very nice for us to be able to 3-bet and then shove with a pair and essentially be able to collect a lot of dead money like that. If somebody's 3-betting you a lot, min-raising is a very good defense. We sort of talked about this before when we were on the button. We're saying, oh, raise smaller if you've got a really light 3-better in the blinds because it maximizes your position and skill advantages, and it sort of defeats their ability to collect dead money. This works just as well heads up. So a lot of the best players will be min-raising pre-flop against good players. And then the last part is when we're 3-betting pre in a heads-up game, we can definitely widen our value ranges for sure. But we have to be very, very aware of how our opponents are adjusting to these things. I.e., if we 3-bet and a guy's folding every single time, we then can't stack off light when he decides not to fold this time. By the same token, if a guy has never folded to our 3-bet once, we might not be able to fold pocket 10s on a queen high board. But okay, I think that does it for the slideshow. We have about 20 minutes plus before we keep going. But now this is going to be question time. So I'm just going to unmute you, unless you don't have a mic. Matt asks, could you give us an idea of air quality when 3-betting with 100 big blind stacks? Is King 8 suited and 7-5 suited or 4-4 better? I assume you don't like 3-betting 9-10 suited out of position because it's too strong and just a call versus a button open. Actually, your assumption about 9-10 suited is a little bit off. The biggest factor about why I don't really like doing 9-10 suited per se is that its equity isn't strong enough in a 3-bet pot to make it good. In the sense of, if somebody's going to call me with, pocket 10s or King Jack, I'm getting a lot of money in pre as a huge dog. Now, there's a lot of other reasons why calling with 9-10 suited isn't good as well. Like, it plays better in a smaller pot, pre-flop for sure. But it's sort of what types of hands am I putting myself up against? One of the things 9-10 suited relies on a lot is fold equity. And we don't really have much or as much in a 3-bet pot. And so it's not good for us to try to do that, try to do this type of thing when we don't have fold equity. We prefer to play our hand when it has fold equity in general. Hopefully that answers your question. So the question, if we're talking about 3-betting from the blinds, King 8 suited is like a really easy 3-bet against sort of someone who's playing pretty well against you. By the same token, 7-5 suited is usually a call or a fold. By the same token, pocket 4s is either like a 3-bet if we have no post-flop image, or it's a call if we do have post-flop image. Because we'd like to be able to play our hand for either its pair value or its set value. And if we call, we're doing it more for set value, and that's fine. And if we 3-bet, then we're doing it more to like essentially as for its pair value, and because it's a good hand to balance with the 3-bet pots. One thing I will say though is do not fold small pairs from the blinds. They have enough value to be played for sure, whether or not it's in a 3-bet situation or in a call. Does anybody else have questions? Okay, so Matt has another question for us. Can you go into the dynamics of playing small pocket pairs out of position? The quick answer to that question is not really in detail today, because that's another hour-long plus discussion to get into. But I can talk about it with relation to its development when it comes to which is basically saying that if we can't 3-bet or if we can't call him like a small pocket pair from the blinds, or we can't check raise it profitably when we hit a set, we should be very inclined to 3-bet it. We should definitely not fold it. I'm going to unmute Kelly right now so Kelly can ask this question. Kelly, you're unmuted. What's up?
Okay. I thought, so you're talking about, say, late position wars where you're on the button. And calling versus 4-betting hands versus, like, say, ace-king or 8s or 5s. You said, a lot of times when you have ace-king on the button and someone from the blinds 3-bet you, then you call and you take a flop. I would think it'd be better to 4-bet and get it all in there, because I thought part of the point with ace-king is you want to see all 5 cards. Whereas, say, a pocket pair, say like your 5s example or something, there, you could take a flop, see if you hit a set. I guess I feel more inclined to be aggressive pre-flop with the ace-king type hands than with, say, the pocket pairs, which generally I'm either folding, or if it's a late position war and the person's just 3-betting a ton, then I'm even fine getting it in with, say, pocket 8s or pocket 5s.
Sure. But I'm gonna keep you unmuted for a second because I want to hear your response to my counter argument. Okay? So the first thing I would say is this. You notice that I'm not folding ace-king on many flops, right?
Right.
So in terms of the argument of, are we going to see 4 or 5 cards, or all 5 cards per se, the answer is with ace-king very often if we call pre-flop. In fact, the times when we aren't, it's usually good. I.e., if the guy bets the flop and shoves the turn, it was usually a good thing we decided not to see 5 cards with ace-king. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other element is this. There's a very good reason for wanting to 4-bet pre. Collecting dead money is a great thing to be able to do. If someone has a lot of air in their range, we love being able to 4-bet and making them fold a lot and collect it. That said, we don't necessarily need ace-king to do that. The only thing that's nice about ace-king is if they shove, we can stack off and we'll basically be a flip against their range, Well, welcome to the world of doing that with, any pocket pair as well.
Okay.
Ace King isn't particularly that strong to get it in pre-flop with, unless, as I said before, you think the guy is really likely to 4-bet you or to shove over the top with Ace Queen. If he is, then you're 4-betting for straight value. You know what I mean? You're just trying to get a worse hand to go in with you. But when you can't get a worse hand to go with you, which is certainly somewhat likely, it's a little bit of a sort of like the easy way out. You know what I mean? You let your opponent play perfectly and just say, I'm going to take a plus EV play and collect dead money. It's definitely plus EV. I'm not arguing that it's not. I'm just saying that calling and letting your opponent make mistakes post is almost certainly more plus EV.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
What about hands like King Queen suited out of position that can flop good equity post flop, combo draws, but perhaps not good equity pre-flop versus their stack off range? Can we call and check raise these flops, or is this spew? You can certainly call and check raise the flop with a hand like King Queen suited out of position. But that said, what we're more concerned about is whether or not we can get value from it pre-flop first. If our tens equity wasn't strong enough to really do this, King Queen has pretty similar equity to pocket tens, in the sense of it's good against some things, it's not good against others, but it's really not that good in general. And it's certainly not good enough for us to be able to play it profitably out of position against somebody with both initiative and usually someone of a strong range. This is one of those things where oftentimes it just we have to like kind of sigh deeply because our hand looks very pretty, but then we have to get rid of it. In theory, you could be able to, if you played very, very, very well, be able to play hands like pocket tens, pocket jacks, ace queen, and king queen out of position when you call a 3-bet. In theory, most everyone I know is not good enough to do that. Even the ones who are will usually say that it's better to just 4-bet them or fold them. It sucks when someone 3-bets you and you've got a really pretty hand that you're looking forward to play, but we still don't have enough equity to do this post-flop given 100 big blinds. Given 200 big blinds, definitely. We definitely could. Got enough equity, got enough fold equity post-flop, etc. For sure. Okay, Orcus has a question. Can you expand on c-betting on the flop in 3-bet pots in position and out of position heads up? Sure. My policy when it comes to c-betting is quite simple. If I have anything good, I'm going to bet it for value. If I don't have anything good, I'm going to bet it to collect dead money, either for thin value or as a thin bluff. And if I don't have anything good, and I think the guy is really unlikely to fold, if he's going to play back at me a lot, then I'm going to just give up. So, for example, let's say I've been 3-betting a guy all the time, and I 3-bet him from the big blind with ace-king, and he calls with whatever, and the flop is 10-9-8 rainbow, or 10-10 with a flush draw. I'm not going to c-bet that if I think that he's not going to fold often enough, and he usually won't. So I can usually just get away with just check folding there. That said, if I 3-bet pocket kings and the flop comes down ace-5-3, I'm going to c-bet for both thin value and to collect dead money, get him to fold his pocket tens or whatever it is that he has. I mean, either get him to fold his pocket tens or get him to call his pocket tens are both better than letting him check back his pocket tens and try to hit a 10. And essentially, whether in position, out of position, in general, we're just going to be wanting to c-bet it pretty much the whole time. And then, by the way, it was I guess I phrased that badly. Not the whole time. We want to c-bet it like the so long as we think that he's going to fold enough that we can do it profitably. If we've got total air and we don't think he's ever folding, then we don't need to do that. Okay. Edward has a question again. Let's ask Edward. What's up, Edward?
Okay. It's something that I know it's kind of trivial, but you didn't really touch on it very much. That what kind of criteria do you have for flatting versus 4-betting when you wake up with queens to aces or something, and you have reason to believe, say there's two situations I'm thinking of. You raise early, a fish flats, and then maybe a reg 3-bets the blinds. You have a good hand.
Sure.
What are you more inclined to do in this situation?
If I have a really, really strong hand that I think, okay, it's a very simple question to ask myself every time. It's just, can I raise this for value now? Right? And if I can, then I'm going to. So if I've got aces and I raise and a fish calls and a regular squeezes, I'm going to do a dance. I'm gonna re-raise there for sure. If I've got aces, if I've got kings. If I've got queens, I probably would too, because it's a squeeze dynamic. He certainly could be squeezing with jacks, 10, something like that, and then stack off with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if I've got a really strong hand and I can raise for value now, then I'm going to. If I can't raise for value now, then I have to really make some considerations. So if my next question is, well, if I've got, let's say, pocket queens or ace king, let's say, and I say, I'm going to mute you actually now, sorry. If I've got ace king, and I say, well, if I get in here, it's not really for value. Say, well, I'm getting this a flip usually most of the time. Is there enough dead money in the pot to compensate? And usually in that spot, seeing as I'm out of position, then the answer is yes. I'm rarely going to be calling a 3-bet against a squeeze with a strong hand, because I usually the dynamic is as such that I can re-raise for value. The only times that I'm flatting is when I don't think I can actually re-raise for value. Okay, actually, I'm just going to unmute you so you can ask yourself, Bill. Here you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Bill.
Okay, along the same lines with flattening the ace-king in position and so forth, I've done this quite a bit lately with mixed results, and the problem is when I'm against an aggressive villain, and he knows when I flat, it looks like I've got 2 7s, 2 8s, 2 9s, whatever. It comes Jack XX. He fires, I flat. He still thinks I've got what I've got. Now say 10, putting backdoor flush cards and so forth. He's got cards. Who knows what he has? And he fires hard again. This happens all the time because my range looks so weak.
Sure. So this is the question that you need to ask yourself. This is sort of one of the amusing questions that I get relatively often. I'm going to put you on mute again, Bill. Keep the background noise down. I oftentimes hear players say, "Oh, I don't really feel comfortable calling with 8s there and calling the flop because I think he's going to double barrel me so often on the turn." Well, let's take that board for example. A Jack XX turns a 10. Let's say that we decide that we think he's going to fire on the turn with ace king and ace queen and king queen every time. If that's the case, then it may be time for us to make a big and then let's say he has some like random backdoor flush cards that he picked up as well. Well, the more air that we add into his range, the more things that he's double barreling with that don't beat us, the more we're gonna have to man up and make a big call, or I mean obviously we'd shove at that point. But the sort of response to this is that you're right. One of the things that someone can do if we start calling these 3-bets lightly is to start bluffing us a lot. But that's actually not bad. We don't mind if someone's bluffing us a lot if we've got a better hand than them more, enough of the time. And the truth is that if we're playing hands that have equity, I'll give you a great example of this. So, this is like a pretty common scenario. I call a 3-bet. I raise king queen suited. A guy 3-bets me. The flop comes down. Queen 4-3, and he bets, and I call because I got top pair kicker, and the turn card is an ace of clubs, putting 2 clubs out on the board, and then he makes another bet. Now against somebody with a range that's sort of more like mine, which is sort of more ace centric, more high card centric, this is a very tough play with king queen. There was a very, very, very close decision if someone was like playing against me. However, I had a note on this person that said 3-bet suited connectors. So all of a sudden became an easy call because I knew that on that ace turn, I could basically guess that he was going to fire his entire range, or much of his entire range. And it turns out that he had picked up a gut shot. Or no, he had a gut shot on the flop. He had 7-6, 7-6 on a queen 3-4 ace board. And then he's firing again on the ace. The sort of moral of the story is there's going to be some guesswork involved, but you can help yourself out by taking a good note when you see somebody 3-bet a hand and get the showdown. I'm not going to take a note if somebody gets the showdown with queens, but I will if they get the showdown with 9-8 suited. Because that lets me know that, if I've got pocket 9s, and I think someone's going to be 3-betting 6-7 suited, and the flop is Jack 8-5, and the turn card is a is a 10, I can call because if he's got 6-7 suited there for the straight draw, he's probably going to shove it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. But there are players like this that'll make it difficult for us. The way we do it is we're going to have to basically think about making some big calls. Okay. Matt Janda, let's unmute you.
Hello?
You there, Matt?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so my question was when we were talking about jamming like 5s to jacks on the button against a 3-bet, I don't see how you're really going to be able to balance that if you're flatting ace-king and then you're 4-betting aces and kings, because like those are the hands I would think you'd need to balance it out with.
Sure. It was sort of not the point about jamming like the basically jamming pairs. Obviously, if we're jamming 5, you can jam deuces. Also, doesn't really matter. Is usually more when we get 3-bet when we're out of position. Okay.
Okay.
So like it's more like we raise the cutoff. Somebody 3-bets us really lightly from the button, and we got a hand like say pocket 6s, which we know is like doing fine against his range, and he'll fold a ton of air, and it's definitely plus EV to 4-bet it. But we'd rather 4-bet shove it and get him to fold something like, I don't know, ace queen, ace jack that he might talk himself into shoving if we 4-bet small.
So do you balance it out with any of the big pairs, or do you just bet those to 25 BBs, or how do you balance?
Yeah, so I'm not going to balance it to start with. This is one of the things about balancing. You don't need to balance unless your opponent gives you a need to, right?
Okay.
You don't balance your value raising range against a fish because they're a fish. They do bad stuff, so we don't bluff them with balancing. So I'm not going to balance my shoving pre-flop range until I see somebody 3-bet me with 7s and snap my shove, right?
Okay.
And then when somebody does that, then I got a pretty easy game where I'm going to then shove 8s. There's no foolproof answer to how to win, but the simple truth is that people don't usually respond quickly or well, and we can definitely get away with this for the most part, by the way, because they'll almost always fold when we shove, and when they do, they'll have no idea what we had.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So it's difficult for them to figure it out. Okay, cool. I'm going to put you back on mute. And we'll take a few more questions because I'm enjoying myself. Oh my God, we got a lot of questions still coming in. I'm going to take the rest of these questions here through Steve Mathai's question on check calling the flop and stuff. Oh my God, we got a lot of them right now. Jenna says, it's good to 3-bet pocket pairs in the blinds with no image because it's easy to play a 3-bet pot post flop. But this, you mean, can we stack off with it? We flop a set, if we miss, we see it, and give up if he calls. Yes, that's basically what I mean in terms of when I say it's easy to play. But the also important thing is this. We're never going to get stuck in the pot as a dog. If we 3-bet 7-8 suited, we oftentimes will flop a flush draw and get stuck in the pot for stacks when we c-bet when we're 35 to win or worse. With a pocket pair, we either win or we don't. When we have ace king and we flop top pair, we either win or we don't. I.e., like we either flop top pair or we don't. But when we do, it's pretty much an equity lock. Compare the equity of ace king on an ace 3-4 board to pocket queens. Then compare the equity of pocket 3s on that same board to pocket queens, and you'll find out that they're basically the same. Okay, cool. Now that should answer your question quickly enough. Steve has a question. So we're going to ask Steve his question right now, and then we're going to get to Ryan Niels next. Steve, you there?
Yeah, hey Andrew.
Hey, what's up, man?
Yeah, just basically want to get some of your general opinions on the check call line that sees so many regulars taking when they 3-bet kings and the flop comes ace high. They go into kind of check call, check guess mode.
Sure,
is it ever a good idea, or should you really just be betting out 100% of your range there just to make it easy to play and to balance your range?
Really good question. This is a extremely hotly contested issue among high-stakes players, and it's by far the most difficult chapter I had to write in my book about this sort of subject. But my philosophy is that we should bet this essentially because I think it's unlikely for people to bluff us often enough for us to be able to check call profitably. And if that's the case, then we're either check calling and getting value owned, or we're checking and then they're oftentimes going to check back their worst hands, giving them a free chance to outdraw us, which is obviously bad as well. The nice benefit of this also is that it's obviously very easy to play. It makes our life a whole hell of a lot easier if we just bet and then we can figure out from there. So I would say that really we should be betting, and we should really try to avoid that check call game. I don't think we should do it. Cool. Ryan Neal.
Yeah, how's the audio?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?
Oh, good. My question is regarding c-betting in 3-bet pots. Are we going to prefer to c-bet on a good flop texture or based on flopped equity?
Both of those factors are going to be involved. So basically, like if we have, let's say we 3-bet King Jack and the flop is Queen 10-4, we're obviously going to c-bet that because we've got great equity. But if we've got pocket jacks and the flop, or say if we've got King Jack, let's say, and the flop is Ace 9-6, we're going to c-bet that also because it's great board texture for us, right? Anytime we're being aggressive without a hand, we need to have a combination of our pot equity and our fold equity. And those are usually pretty easy to evaluate. In fact, if you watch the most recent video that I did on Deuces Cracked, we talk about how to evaluate fold equity. And that should, I mean, it should be pretty easy to know, you know, how does the board texture affect how much fold equity I have, can I c-bet? So if we, like I said, we have Ace-King on a 10-9-8 board against a guy with we have a ton of history against, I'm probably just going to check fold. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess a follow-up question to that would be, is it going to be very opponent-related? Would we be weighting it, taking overweighting one side if we're on a bad opponent, or maybe the other way if it's against a good opponent?
The answer to that question is definitely yes. In fact, and this is also talked about in the most recent video, but the player type is by far the most important factor when it comes to our evaluation of fold equity. So keep in mind, by the way, most bad players will just fold flops when they miss. They'll just play fit or fold, like we talked about with the passive strategy, passive response. If you see somebody who's playing that sort of like passive response, but they don't fold post flop, they're calling everything. It's okay to not c-bet. The criteria that I gave you, whether it's against a good player or a bad player, was if we have air and we think he calls too much, then we just give up. You know what I mean? It's a pretty simple criteria, and that's balanced, by the way, by equity. So if we have a ton of equity, and we think that he's going to call me a lot, but I still win a lot, then we can usually still c-bet. But if we don't have that much equity, and he's going to call us a lot, whether he's good or bad, then we just don't c-bet. We just give up. Okay?
Yep, great.
Cool. Let's see if we have any more. Well, a question from Steve, and then we're talking about bet size, get 3 pots, then we're going to be done. Although Michael has a hand raised. Michael Savansky. You there, Michael?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, you had a question?
Yes, I wanted to know more about when you raise tens, jacks, king, queen suited, hands like that, and you get 3-bet by a good aggressive player. So do you just fold these hands out of position, or you were talking about shoving the pairs, but isn't that kind of spewy?
So let's take tens and jacks, because king queen suited I think is worse equity in a lot of cases than tens and jacks. So we'll take tens and jacks for this in this event. So if we think the guy's 3-bets a lot, we might be able to say, I could 4-bet small. But the problem is if you run the equity calculation, you'll find that if you 4-bet small against any reasonable range for him shoving in, you're still going to have to call with pocket tens if he shoves. So if we're going to have to call when he shoves, we might as well just shove ourselves because we might get him to fold some hands that would be good for us for him to fold. Hands like ace-queen. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yeah, but on the other hand, when you 4-bet small, you can make him bluff, and when you shove, you just get called by better hands.
Sure. I mean, the implication would be that we don't think that necessarily he's going to bluff with hands that are worse than flipping with us. You know what I mean? Like if we get him to shove king queen and we've got pocket tens, that's bad for us. Do you see it?
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Let's see if anyone else has questions. Aaron has a hand raised from way early. Aaron, what's up?
Yeah, 2 things regarding the flatting ace-king and the button versus the big blind. First, would you assume that until you see the big blind getting it in light that they're not going to, and then generally like flat? Okay, so given that, can you talk about situations where you might do something other than flat call a c-bet? Like what sort of boards would you ever shove in, like on a jack-10 high board or something, or like if it was it was monotone, you had the ace?
Yeah, I definitely float on a jack-10 high board, and I might consider raising it on an ace high board because, especially with a flush draw, because I can potentially get him to stack off with like kings, queens right there. But the only other response is this: I would actually sometimes consider folding on like a queen high board, like especially like a queen 9 board. Because a queen, if you're flatting pre-flop with ace king, the only card you don't want to see on the flop is a queen. Because a queen smashes like a ton of the range that we were really happy that he had already. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, in general, assuming no queen high board, I'm pretty much going to flat with almost everything, given 100 big blind stacks. Once again, on an ace high board, I would consider raising sometimes as well. But in general, there's really no benefits per se to raising flops in the sense that I think I'm a huge favorite most of the time. If he doesn't have a pair, if he does have a pair, I'd like to see the cheap card. And usually it gives me a chance to take advantage of my equity or encourage bluffs from him later. You really can't imagine how often I flat pre with ace king, call a flop bet, and the turn card's an ace, and I just get a free stack from whatever it is that he has. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so that'd be sort of my response to that question, if that answers your question.
It does. What about like 7, 8, 9 boards?
I would still call.
Okay.
You know, what's he trying to bluff me off of? He's trying to bluff me off of, you know. I mean, what could I have that he can try to bluff me off? Probably not a good thing. You know, most likely. And this is one thing. I'm going to leave with some general comments at the end of this. But one of them is that when people fire that second barrel on the turn, they're usually not bluffing. They usually have it. Just think about how many times you see people check it down with ace king or overcards, you know, after they miss. Usually they don't have it. Okay. What the hell? Well, let Steve ask one more question because I'm feeling generous. Steve's making good use of the question scenario. What's up, Steve?
Hey again. Yeah, just I quite often find myself in a spot where I'm on the button with say jacks or queens or something, and the cutoff opens. Sure. 3-bet for value, and he kind of 4-bets over me after I've 3-bet, and I'm really kind of not too sure whether I can get it in profitably because his 4-bet range might be extremely tight. If that's the case, where I'm not really sure how I'm going to respond to a 4-bet, should I just be flatting more often and only 3-betting hands where I know, how I'm going to respond to a 4-bet?
No, it's more the real question is how is he going to respond to your 3-bet? Because if he's going to respond to your 3-bet by calling a lot, then yeah, hell yeah, you should be 3-betting it for value, right?
Yeah, initially the plans for value, but then the new information of a 4-bet, it's okay to just go ahead and fold if we think he's going to be shoving an extremely tight range or 4-bet.
Sure, yeah. If we put his range on kings or kings or aces, yeah. That's fine. I mean, there's no absolute rules. Believe it or not, one time I actually folded pocket kings pre-flop. You know what I mean? It's possible to evaluate these things, sure, but you're going to have a tight read for that. I wouldn't, if I 3-bet queens for value and then a regular who I thought could 4-bet lightly 4-bet me, then I'm just going to jam every time.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up then with some final observations and then, like I said, a slight request, which is the observations are this. The assumptions that we sort of outlined with these responses and the sort of general ranges attached to them are usually pretty accurate. It only takes somebody to violate one of these assumptions one time, and I'll put a note on them. I rarely put notes. It's only when one of my assumptions is violated. So, let's say I have a regular player who I think is an aggressive, good player. When he 3-bets me, I think he probably has a pretty decently strong range for this. That doesn't include a lot of junk. Then we get to showdown, and I see that he has a suited connector. I will immediately make a note on that and realize that now if he's 3-betting 7-6 suited, calling pre-flop with pocket 8s just got a whole hell of a lot better. So now I'm going to defend wider because he's 3-betting me with hands that don't play well in 3-bet pots. You can see that if we get to showdown and I have queen jack, or he's got queen jack and I've got pocket 8s, pocket 8s is still like about as good as it was before because queen jack didn't really affect anything. It's still 50-50. Whereas you add more and more junk, the more and more widely we can defend pre-flop. So keep our eyes open for showdowns. Showdowns in 3-bet pots will tell us what our opponent's 3-bet ranges are far more effectively than stats will. That's huge. Do not hesitate to 3-bet more often in position against regulars than you do. Just keep doing it, but do it with hands that are not more valuable post-flop. Don't waste the value of your ace-queen, your ace-jack, your 9-8 suited with a 3-bet pre-flop. You can call with those hands and play them very profitably post. However, if you're just going to 3-bet a hand for the sake of it, do it with your king-6 suited and your ace-7 off. even as low as your Jack 5 suited and your 10-4 off. All okay. All fine. So, the last observation I would say is this. And you've probably heard me say before, people are bluffing you less often than you think. And that's true. By the same token, people are 3-betting you light less often than you think. Before you start taking radical action to play back at somebody, you better be damn sure that they're playing back at you a lot. If somebody 3-bets me twice over the course of 20 minutes, I'm not going to freak. If somebody 3-bets me 10 times over 30 minutes, I'm going to freak. And so we need to basically be moderated in how far we expand what it is that we're doing. It's impossible to cover everything related to every 3-bet situation ever in the course of an hour and a half, or what's I guess now an hour and 45 minutes. But this is definitely the framework that you need to beat mid-stakes games with regards to 3-betting.